Glen Hiemstra, our keynote speaker this morning, is a man of vision. He is the founder and owner of the Futurist.com, and he is an internationally respected expert on future trends, long-term planning, and creating the preferred future. Once you hear Glen Hiemstra speak, the future will probably never look the same. I wish you a great conference. Ladies and gentlemen, Glen Hiemstra.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. I will answer the first three questions, 6'7". Yes, I did. Back when players were very skinny and the shorts were very short. And how did I get to become a futurist? Well, I was a college student at a little college in Spokane, Washington, when that particular college hired a new president whose name was Dr. Ed Lindemann. Ed Lindemann came to the college direct from the Apollo spacecraft program, where he was director of program planning for Apollo. And he taught a particular way of thinking about the future, which I will in part share with you this morning. Still an inspiration to me. He's been gone for quite a long time now. And there are avenues to become a professional futurist. The most well-known one, interestingly enough, is right here in Houston at the University of Houston. It's a Future Studies program right here. But I came to it through this more indirect route. In the early part of my life, I was a college professor and began to do some consulting on the side. And then about a couple of decades ago, began working full-time as a futurist. Fortunate enough to have registered Futurist.com back in the day. There's a story attached to that. So for about 2 decades now, I've been working with enterprises of all kinds, both private and public, large manufacturing, to energy, to software, to healthcare. And I get the same invitation, generally speaking, over and over again. The invitation sounds something like this. We routinely look at the future on a fairly short-term horizon when we do strategic planning. Let's say 3 to 5 years, which is really quite typical, as we all know. This time, we'd like to look further into the future than we usually do. Now, that might be just simply through a presentation, but it might also be through a more intensive kind of process, a strategic planning or a long-range planning process, if you will, that might involve developing some scenarios or looking a couple of decades ahead. The most interesting one that I was thinking about as we were watching the introductory material about life cycles was a foundation that asked me, along with many others, to come together to ask this question: what will it take for humanity to survive for 1,000 years? It was the only 1,000-year view futuring project that I've ever worked on. That was really quite interesting. So here we are to think about the future of organizations, and in particular the kinds of organizations that you're in a world which we all know now has become very software-centric and becomes increasingly software-centric as we go forward, where most of what we do, most of what we imagine doing, and particularly most of what we imagine doing if we're going to be more resilient and if we're going to be more successful in the future, involves a better application of better software than anything that's existed before. We've been here before in times of change. We clearly live in a time of significant change. We've been here before. I appreciated Ty's introduction with the correct pronunciation of my last name, Hiemstra, which is the very Dutch pronunciation. I'm going to tell you a quick story about my paternal grandparents. I did come, my parents on both sides, grandparents on both sides of my family came from the Netherlands. My father, grandfather, the one named Hiemstra, came from a province in Holland called Friesland, and he came about 105 years ago to the United States, about 1910. He was very young, had a very young bride. They decided to homestead in Montana. He had grown up as a child in the 1890s, dreaming of coming to the United States, and in particular of coming to the western United States. And so he came to Montana, where he attempted to be, along with his family and a number of other Dutch settlers in this particular area, to be dry land wheat farmers. It turned out to be a pretty tough time to be dryland wheat farmers. There was a lot of drought going on. The land was very rocky. It was not as nice as they had been led to believe. But they stuck it out for about 15 years until one last hailstorm wiped out one last wheat crop. And my grandfather loaded the family, which now consisted of 5 children, into a truck which they now owned. And they headed for Pendleton, Oregon, where they knew that wheat farming would be better. But the truck broke down in Nampa, Idaho. And they couldn't get it fixed on the weekend. They attended a church, being church-going people. And the people there said, there's no need to go on to Oregon, just stay right here in Idaho, which is how I came to be born in Nampa then some years later. What's interesting about that time period, let's say the years about 1900 to about 1925 or 1930, is how comparable they are to today. I never asked my grandparents this question, but I suppose that they looked back sometime in the late 1920s as they sat across the kitchen table late one night and looked at each other and said, you know, it's unbelievable how different our lives are now compared to when we were growing up as little children back in Holland in the 1890s. What had happened in about a 25-year time period? Well, x-rays were discovered, the radio was invented, the cause of malaria was discovered, the advent of electricity, which had of course been known about, became very common, the electrification of the country. The internal combustion engine and the whole takeoff into the whole industry that you're all so familiar with really happened in that 25-year time period. People moved off the farms into cities and towns, and really the beginnings of suburbs. And the Wright brothers flew an airplane, and World War I happened. And there was a lot of political change in the world, and it all happened in about a 25-year time period. It's really an unbelievable amount of change. And the good news is that they did just fine. Things got better, some things got worse, and they did just fine through all of that. I think, and I've said this for some time, that we're reliving the lifetime of my grandparents. It might be yours, it might be your great-grandparents. If you look at the years, let's say the 1990s and certainly around 2000 out to the year, let's say 2025 or 2030, when we look back from the perspective of 2025 or 2030, I think we'll see something quite similar. So I work with organizations that are trying to get a handle on this kind of world of change. And I work with them when they want to do this longer range than normal planning. And what I've discovered in doing that is at the end of the day, most planning turns out, even when we're trying to do better than this, turns out to be a search for a more efficient past, rather than a search for a truly new future. Let me give you a couple of illustrations. This came out just last week, a week ago Monday, from the Morgan Stanley company, Adam Jonas writing this particular report, about the future of one of the primary end users of the kinds of products that you're interested in, that is automobiles and vehicles that drive. And what Adam Jonas wrote is this: as we have written for some time, we expect all car companies would eventually see nearly 100% of their revenues shift from the sale of human-driven, individually owned cars to robot-driven, shared cars. And they produced this 4-quadrant chart that you see on the screen. On the lower left is today, which is about a 100-year-old model of human-driven, primarily individually owned automobiles. On the lower right, we know that we are moving toward a somewhat more shared economy with companies like Uber, that I'll mention again a little bit later in the presentation, where there might be a shared resource that people just use from time to time. And that's the so-called shared economy. We also know that there are all the experiments going on with robot-driven or autonomous vehicles in the upper left. But we kind of assume that if vehicles become autonomous, we will still own them. And what Morgan Stanley is wondering, and actually arguing in this particular report released last week, is that eventually where we're going to move is to a shared autonomous future for vehicles, which has tremendous implications for one of the primary uses of the products that you're interested in. That's an example of what we would need to ask or focus on if we wanted to get ready for a truly new future rather than a more efficient past. We spend a lot of time trying to make that 100-year-old model in the lower left more efficient. But what if the model changes in the next what, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, maybe 50 years? What if the model changes as fundamentally as Morgan Stanley is suggesting? What happens if we stay in our lane too long? We had that wonderful picture of the dinosaur a bit earlier. This is what happens if you stay in your lane too long. You end up on the cover of Fortune magazine, and not in a good way. Now, this is a cover that I came across early in my career as a futurist. It's actually from the 1990s. And on the cover, you see 3 dinosaur shapes. They have names: IBM, Sears, and General Motors. And in this particular article, the Fortune writers were asking quite seriously, have these 3 companies named 30 years before, at the time of the writing of this article, named 30 years before by Peter Drucker, the great management professor, as the best managed companies in the history of the world, have they literally become so poorly managed 30 years later that they're in danger of going extinct? What happened to them? Well, they each had a number of different things, of course, were happening to them, but one of the things that happened is they each had an image of the future, of retailing or the automobile business or of computing, and they focused on business strategies that would keep them successful in that future. And meanwhile, the world was going somewhere else, either before they noticed or much more likely before they took seriously what they were noticing. That is, companies, and I'm quite sure that this was true, and I've talked to people from GM about this, and I know that it was true there. Companies are full of people saying, hey, wait a minute, the world's going over here. And what's the normal response, or the typical response? Well, you might be right, but we have a lot of investment in how we're doing things now. We have to use that up. You might be right, but I'm retiring in 2 years. You guys worry about it later. You might be right, but we're just too busy to deal with anything new right now. We have too many emergencies and too many problems going on right now. We just can't even deal with it. Perhaps an equally good and perhaps an even better example is this guy, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment as I'm standing here, but he's holding in his right hand the first digital camera ever invented. He was an engineer working for the Kodak company when he invented that machine in his right hand in 1975. It's a camera lens, it's a recording device. The image was actually recorded on a little cassette tape. They could play it back on a television screen. And he came up with it, showed it to everybody in Kodak, that is the senior management, and what did they ask him to do? Not just not develop, but they asked him to keep it secret from the other engineers, to not reveal it to anybody else, which they didn't do. Now he holds in his left hand the digital camera that Kodak later tried to catch up with, and of course it didn't work out for them. They went from 108,000 people down to about 8,000 people after going through a bankruptcy. They still exist. They are still there in the Northeast. What happened? They had an image of the future, of how to stay successful, and they were afraid of getting out of the lane that they were in. Who's not afraid? If you're not afraid, you have to be willing to anticipate disruptive changes. You have to be willing to see preferred future directions early, and literally to develop shared images of the future and fold them back on the present so that you can see more clearly the kinds of things that you ought to be doing today. 2 stories that I like are Bill Gates and Alan Mulally. Now, Bill Gates, of course, at Microsoft did some great things and did some things that were not so great as they got caught by surprise themselves. Turns out in the early 1990s, I got to sit on a panel, a 2-person panel with Bill, in front of 100 high school kids one summer evening. They were all in a leadership program called the Governor's Leadership School in the state of Washington. And so it was Bill and me. Now, I didn't know he was going to become quite so wealthy and famous, but he didn't know that I was not going to become wealthy and famous. So for one summer evening, we were kind of on equal footing. And I never really forgot what he said. This was in the early 1990s. And he said, by the early 21st century, this is what I think I see. He said, at Microsoft, we don't think we can anticipate where technology is going beyond about 3 years because the development cycles are so quick. But he said, this is the world that I imagine for the early 21st century. I think I'll still be going to work because there's a lot of advantages to getting together as human beings, even no matter how good communication technology might be. But before I go, he said, the first thing that might happen in the morning is I'll wake up and I'll look at all the pictures in my house and I think, today I want Da Vinci. And I'll say to some device, I want Da Vinci, and all the pictures in my house will change to Leonardo da Vinci, which of course he did. in his own home and by buying and creating certain kinds of companies. But then he said, then I decided I have some spare time to go on a simulated hike in the Grand Canyon in a surround virtual reality booth with some simulated personalities, and I think that artificial intelligence will be sufficient that I could carry on a real-time conversation with simulated Hollywood personalities while I'm going on this imagined hike in the Grand Canyon. It turns out he was wrong about that. We're really not quite there, even though we're 15 years into the 21st century. Later, Bill Gates said that one of the lessons he learned at Microsoft is this, and I think it's a really important one. We tend to overestimate how quickly certain technological changes are going to be common in the marketplace. We tend to overestimate how fast things are going to happen. But at the same time, we tend to underestimate how much they will change our business once they do happen. And he said they learned that lesson over and over again at Microsoft. Alan Mulally is another guy that I met in the early 1990s when I was doing some training work for the Boeing company. He was a rising star at Boeing. Everybody expected him to become the head of Boeing, but instead he went off to become the head of Ford and is largely credited with having rescued Ford from the potential of bankruptcy a few years ago. And Mulally became famous at Ford for this kind of management, communicating an inspiring vision, making his values known, which became really called at Ford One Ford. They had too many things, too many disparate operations, too much disconnection between different departments, too many different engineering processes, too many different everything that you can imagine, and he really focused them to zero down into one way of doing things and one way of thinking things to get everybody on the same page. And he got everybody on the same page weekly and became very famous for this at Ford through his weekly business planning review processes in which everybody, senior management, would be responsible for communicating how they're doing on implementing the business plan. That's somebody who attempted to not just live with disruptive change, but to create disruptive change in the organization that he was in. What he was good at, and what those who are really good at managing and helping to create disruptive change doing is asking and answering this question: what is your image of the future? And you can break that down to three more specific questions. What is probable in the future that you should be getting ready for? What is possible? What is outside the boundaries of the way that you've normally thought about your business? What is ultimately preferred? The first two questions are interesting and useful, but only in as much as they can help you answer the third question. What is our preferred future? And what does that preferred future tell us that we ought to be doing and not doing in order to make that preferred future more likely? In order to answer the question, what is your image of the future, you have to really then look at the future. And it turns out, in my opinion, the future is not nearly so mysterious as we pretend that it is. We often say to each other, and we all know that this is true, well, who knows what's going to happen in the future? Or we say the future is completely unpredictable. It is true that the future is not perfectly predictable, but there are all kinds of things that are likely to be true in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, which are anywhere from very knowable to relatively knowable. What are some of these things? Well, in your world, everybody's familiar with this kind of a curve. The price of oil at the beginning of the year, the price of oil now, I know it should be a little bit less than 40 there in the middle. Yesterday it was down to 38.25, depending on which index you were looking at. And there are serious analysts now that I'm reading who say it's going to go down to 20 before the year's over, which is a pretty mind-boggling number, but nobody believes that it will stay there. It's just a question of when will it go back up, and I just keep thinking, well, you've all seen this before. I don't know why this would hit everybody in any way as a surprise. We've gone through this kind of cycle before, and I think we're just in another one. So that's one thing that we know, and I'm not going to try to make my own prediction on that. I'm going to talk instead about these things that I think are more interesting factors that will influence your future. There's a very famous science fiction writer and futurist here in Texas. His name is Bruce Sterling, and he gives annually the closing speech at the South by Southwest conference, which happens each year in Austin. And the year before this year, in his speech, he said, I can summarize the future in one sentence: old people living in cities afraid of the sky. I'll come back to that. Everything becoming intelligent, technology and manufactured products getting cheaper, optimization of underutilized resources, all of which add up to a challenge to you to think in new ways. Let's talk about this. Old people. Now, some of you I know are not from the US. This is actually a worldwide phenomenon, but this is the US in 2025, 10 years from now, according to the Census Bureau, when we have 27 Floridas in the US. If you want to see the future, go to Florida and look around. And I'm quite serious. You actually begin to get a clue of what the future is going to look like and feel like when you have this many states, all the shaded states, with 20% or more of their population over the age of 65. It really has profound implications for the future of work, for the future of housing, and, interestingly enough, for the future of transportation. The second one, people living in cities. This is relatively well known. This is a United Nations chart looking at the entire world. Until about the year 2006, 2007, through all of human history, the majority of people in the world lived in rural areas, villages and rural areas. After that year, the majority of people live in cities. And going forward, the United Nations expects, until the year 2050, about 70%, some people suggest more, people will be living in cities. Now, when we say cities, we really mean large metro areas like the Houston area here, not everybody in a compact downtown area necessarily, but in these large metro areas. Again, it has profound implications for the future of transportation of all kinds and the future uses and needs for energy. If everybody is moving into cities, it changes the dynamic of how we think about energy and about transportation. And then finally, Bruce Sterling said, older people living in cities afraid of the sky. What does that mean? Well, this is a little silent video of ice in the Arctic. Those of you in the room who are data-centric, as I know most of you are, might enjoy doing what I do from time to time. I go to this website. You can Google it at any time. It's called the Snow and Ice Data Center. Snow and Ice Data Center. It's in Boulder, Colorado, and it's the agency that's in charge of trying to keep track of how much snow and ice there is in the whole world on any given day. And they produce these composite satellite imagery maps of what's happening in the Arctic. And people generally are familiar with the fact that the ice in the Arctic is gradually melting in the summer. Every summer the sun comes up, it's up 24 hours a day, it's above freezing, and the ice melts. It reaches its lowest level of ice each year in mid-September or so. And then, of course, it gets cold and it refreezes and it's dark 24 hours a day. And the Arctic refreezes again until it reaches its ice maximum, usually in about mid-March, and then it begins melting again. That's the cycle. Now, this year, as you can see on that map, the lowest level of ice ever measured since we've been paying attention was in 2012 when the ice in the Arctic looked like this. Thus, we have all the conversation about saving 2 weeks by shipping through the Arctic, and of course the energy exploration that is both proposed and just beginning in the Arctic and so on. This is why we're having this conversation, because this is happening in the Arctic. This year, in March, the amount of ice at ice maximum was the lowest level ever measured for ice maximum. Although, as of yesterday, the last time I looked at the Snow and Ice Data Center, we are tracking slightly behind 2012 in terms of how much ice might be left at the end of this summer. Why is this important? Well, it's an indicator of what is happening cyclically to the planet. Now, we can get into all those political conversations if you wish about how and why and what we should do about this, but the fact is the ice in the Arctic is gradually diminishing at the end of the summer, and weather scientists are beginning to hypothesize that it has an impact potentially on weather in terms of shifting the behavior of the jet stream, leading to longer dry spells, longer wet spells, deeper cold spells, deeper hot spells in the world as the jet stream on the northern part of the planet begins to meander more deeply than it did during the last several thousand years. And thus, if you're afraid of the sky, you might be afraid of this. My son is a photojournalist embedded at this time with a firefighting unit in the forest fires in the state of Washington. He's taking a lot of risks, which we're not too excited about. But he was with this unit on the day that 3 firefighters died not far from where they were here. And it looks pretty frightening, particularly when you understand that these flames can move in the right wind conditions at 100 miles an hour as they move through the trees. And so that's what it looked like at one moment. The next moment they were looking up at the tanker dropping retardant, and the next moment this is what they were all doing to try to get out of this particular area. And there is one hypothesis that we'll see more and more of this as the climate on the weather on planet Earth changes. In fact, out of the since 2000, the state of Washington has had its 10 worst fire seasons ever in its 125-year history, all since the year 2000. So older people living in cities are afraid of the sky. That's sort of baseline. What's more interesting in some ways? Everything becoming intelligent. Michio Kaku is a physicist who said this: in the next 20 years, PCs will be replaced by millions of tiny intelligent systems embedded in clothes, jewelry, cars, furniture, walls, and they'll recognize voice commands and carry out simple wishes. They'll cost less than a penny, less than a scrap of paper. So companies that don't put intelligence into all their products will be at a severe disadvantage. What's interesting about that is he wrote that in 1998, anticipating the 21st century, and thus he was writing about a time period just 3 years from now. We're not quite there, but we're heading there. These sensors cost more than a penny. They don't necessarily respond to voice commands yet, although a few of them might. But we're clearly headed toward building out the Internet of Everything, the largest engineering project, one could argue, in the history of the world. What is it? The platform for devices to communicate with the world around them and to integrate the human, the natural, and the built worlds. Everybody in this room, I know, is familiar with the Internet of Everything. Right now, it's estimated we have about 50 billion sensors attached to the Internet. Cisco, one of our companies out in the display hall, argues that by 2025, it will be, the Internet of Everything will be generating about $14 trillion of economic activity as we make things smart and then connect them to the Internet so that they are telling us things. Now, it might be a rig that's telling us its health or its condition. It might be a highway or a bridge that's telling us its health or condition, or communicating with the automobiles that are on it. It might be any number of things. It might literally be the chairs in an auditorium that are telling the owners of the property whether somebody is sitting in the chair or not. Something as simple as that. That's the Internet of Everything. When things are smart, we live in a different world. You might live with a bed, for example, that can measure your quality of sleep and then adjust itself to change its firmness, to change its warmth, and so on, until you're achieving the optimum sleep. And of course, beds like that exist. You might be wearing a health monitoring device. You might be using a smart pill bottle that's communicating both to you and to perhaps your physician, whether or not you're taking your prescriptions. You might be using a football helmet that has an accelerometer in it that's measuring all the blows that that football helmet is receiving. So when the kid comes out of a football game and says, I'm fine, the coach can say, well, my iPad says you're not, because you just got a blow that's too hard and you have to sit down for a while and go through concussion protocol. All of those things are happening and eventually taking us toward the smart city. The first ever big smart city conference is going to happen in Washington, D.C. in about 3 weeks. A friend of mine is helping to run it. But when you think about the future of the world of energy, circa 2025, 2030 and beyond, we have to start thinking less about individual categories and more about an integrated, intelligent, software-centric world in which all of these things are connected, as you see the kinds of things that are illustrated on the screen here. This intelligent world, of course, takes us into a world where science fiction literally arrives in the form of, for example, this kind of thing, the self-driving car. Now, the video I'm about to show you was very popular when I showed it a couple of weeks ago at the annual meeting of the Area Agencies on Aging. Most of us are familiar with the experiment that Google is running with their driverless cars, but not necessarily with where they ultimately believe they're headed, with a driverless car that has no steering wheel, has no brake pedal, has no gas pedal, literally is just a pod to carry you around. Now extrapolate that to some of your work in terms of not just the end product, but the operations of what you do. Take that kind of intelligence, put it in the maintenance of rigs, put it in drones that are doing inspections. Do that kind of intelligence and imagine it being available everywhere. What we know is that we don't have eyes in the back of our heads, but these kinds of automobiles do. When they come to an intersection, they're seeing 360 degrees for about 200 yards in every direction. And we know that that's just going to continue to improve. Right now, we have 34,000 fatalities in the United States per year, 1.3 million annually. These cars, so far, have driven many millions of miles, have never had an accident caused by the car. They've been in about a dozen accidents caused by human drivers or by drivers in the driverless vehicle who try to take over. Where that's going to head, I think, it becomes kind of obvious. I'll come back to that just before we finish. Some of them will be driven, will be powered by electricity and not by traditional fossil fuels. This is the Tesla Gigafactory being built in Nevada, and it's designed to produce enough batteries for 500,000 vehicles a year. Now, at this point, they're only selling about 50,000 vehicles a year, but you get a sense of their ambitions, and of course, we know that the EV battery prices continue to fall, which takes us to this trend. The cost of manufacturing goods continues to get cheaper. Because we're learning how to automate manufacturing better and better, and make things in new kinds of manufacturing ways, whether it's this 3D printer that's on the space station, or this bank of 3D printers installed at a UPS distribution center in Kentucky this spring, such that if you need to have a part delivered to something, one of your company's areas in, let's say, the Southeast, rather than delivering the part, shipping the part, you could literally dial it up with a piece of software, have it printed at the UPS station in Kentucky, and then have it delivered 24 hours later. That kind of thing means manufacturing products and manufacturing processes gradually drive toward things being cheaper. For example, this 3D LiDAR, so important to self-driving vehicles of all kinds, cost $20,000 to produce in 2009 and cost $29 to produce, or $79 to produce now. The emerging trend, which I think is also going to become the dominant trend, is this one. And it's the last one I want to talk about, and it's kind of like a word salad. Optimizing underutilized resources. We're most familiar with it with these two companies, Uber and Airbnb. Now, Uber is the two phones on the left. Now, what did Uber do? Uber looked around at the world of automobiles and said, most of them sit for about 22 to 23 hours a day, and then they're driven for an hour or two a day. And there's a lot of people who would like to use their automobiles to make a little bit of extra money. What if we created an algorithm, an app, which is all they did, put it in a phone and came up with a way to hook up people who want to go somewhere with vehicles and people who can take them somewhere? And that's now worth, according to Wall Street, $50 billion. And we know exactly what they're doing, and of course there are other companies like Lyft as well. On the right side, of course, is Airbnb. Now, Airbnb has done the same thing. There are people who want places to stay, and there are people who have places where they could stay, whether it's a vacation home or an extra room in the house. I got a big kick out of last spring when the head of the Marriott chain said, in the next 3 years, the Marriott chain is going to add 30,000 new hotel rooms around the world. And the CEO of Airbnb responded, we're going to do that in the next 3 months. That's optimizing underutilized resources, which clearly is a very emergent, perhaps dominant trend. One of the things we might optimize is downtown urban spaces. That's a concept building on the right for an urban village in which 300 people live, but it's also a farm. But it's already coming true in a place like Singapore as you grow greens in a high-rise building in downtown Singapore. You see it in this kind of service now being powered up by Google. So that's clearly Google saying we live in a software-centric world. How can we take all of our systems and provide something that people would really be interested in, which is, could I use solar energy in my home as prices continue to decline, 150 times decline since the 70s down to 50 cents, but the projections are for a continued rapid decline in the cost of solar energy. Solar is basically a manufactured product, and as a manufactured product, it will inevitably become cheaper over time. Solar City, one of the companies founded by the famous Elon Musk, apparently is signing up somebody for solar energy on their home every 3 minutes now, which is a pretty amazing number when you stop to think about it, and Google is going to make that more possible. What about automobiles? I'm going to come back to automobiles. So I asked my son-in-law, who works for Google on the Bringing Android to the Cars project. I said, I'm going to talk to this landmark innovation forum. What should I tell him about the future of automobiles? What he said was, tell him there's going to be 60% fewer automobiles than there are today in the future. The keynoter at the annual World Future Society conference, which happened in San Francisco this year, in July I was there, he argued that as we go into the future, he didn't put a date on this. He said, we're going to go into a world in which there are 10 times fewer cars in the world than there are today as they become autonomous and shared, and car transport becomes a service rather than something that you own. I think it is probably the inevitable end game for automobiles. The question is how soon. I think it's a ways out there. It certainly is beyond probably the time horizon. The fellow you saw from Google, when he spoke for their driverless car project, when he spoke at the TED conference this year, he was asked, how soon do you think you'll have those driverless pods actually on the streets? And he said, this was his answer to the TED conference. He said, let me answer it this way. My son is 7 years old. I don't expect him to need a driver's license. So he's thinking, 7, 8 years or so. I think that's really quite optimistic because I can't figure out how the transition happens. If you could wave a magic wand over the transportation world and change them overnight to everything being autonomous and a large percentage of them being shared, perhaps most of them being shared, I think you could do that, and you could easily imagine that kind of a system working in the urbanizing areas all over the world. But to get from most of the cars being driven by human beings and owned by individuals to that world, it's very difficult to figure out how that transition happens. But if it is possible to work our way through that transition, then I think we get out to the year 2025, 2030, and we begin to see that being real. What does that mean, ultimately, for you folks? Well, I think the cost trends of energy, both what we see happening in the marketplace for your world today, the increasing disconnect between economic development and energy intensity, which has been going on for at least a decade and a half. You add those cost trends, plus what you see happening with things like solar. You add those cost trends, plus the technology trends, plus the environmental trends, plus this trend of optimizing resources in the best way wherever we can in a software-centric world. They all clearly suggest that you're going to live in a world of what I like to label energy turbulence, perhaps even energy transition over some decades period of time. And that's going to require not just today and not just next week or through the rest of this year or until we get back to more normalized oil prices. That's going to require resilience and continuous examination of your own mission and your own business models in the coming years. That's the way it seems to me. Now, the exciting news, of course, is that the people in this room are the people best positioned to engage in that kind of thinking and to provide that kind of resilience through optimizing your underutilized resources in a software-centric world. I wish you the very best at doing that. Remember that most planning is a search for a more efficient past rather than a search for a truly new future. And our challenge, I think, is to search for that truly new future when the time is right and when the opportunity is there. So what is your image of the future? It's a question that I hope you play with as you listen to the presentations, participate in the panels. You'll have a chance to ask them some questions using your phones. Go through the show downstairs. Just keep asking yourself, what is my image of the future? And how am I going to avoid ending up on the cover of Fortune magazine shaped like a dinosaur? I think that's a really interesting challenge. What is your image of the future? In the end, the future is not something that just happens to us. The future is something that we do. So I wish you all the very best in doing the future that you prefer. Thank you very much.